Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of Music Lit 1. Today we're going to talk about a composer whose name you certainly already know, whose name almost everybody in the Western spheres of influence certainly already knows, and that is Ludwig van Beethoven. Listen, I want to keep this real, and here's how I decided to do it. Keeping it real, you know Beethoven's name, but do you know what his name means? Yes, you do, because his last name, Beethoven, in German means beet garden. So we think of Beethoven as this very domineering, probably kind of grouchy and great composer about whom we can never say anything humble because of his greatness. And yet, the point is that Beethoven's last name is something that's very humble indeed. It means Ludwig of the beet garden. Next time you're thinking about Beethoven as this unapproachable figure, think about Ludwig of the beet garden. Okay, so let's get started. Listen, the first thing we need to talk about with Beethoven is how his life and career worked out professionally. In other words, if we think of these composers, Beethoven or anyone else, as people whose music we understand in part through the lens of their life and in part through the lens of the world around them, then if you accept, which seems perfectly reasonable, that their life and the world around them changed over the course of their long career, in Beethoven's case, this is 1770 to 1827, then it makes sense that things are going to look different at different stages in their career. Making this personal for yourself, those of you who compose music, who listen to music, or even who perform or play music, right, you are going to assume that 20 years from now, you're going to be doing things significantly differently than you are right now when you are in your late teens or early 20s, right? This means that somewhere in the middle of that period, between now and 20 years from now, there's going to be a style period for you as a person. The same is true of Beethoven. And so when we look at his life, his career, and that of any other composer, we speak in terms of style periods. That's what you see on my trusty whiteboard right here. A style period refers to a period in the way that a composer composes, creates music, thinks, and it's articulated partly by changes in the world around that composer, and in part by changes in his or her life. In the case of Beethoven, we all know that Beethoven eventually went deaf, which is an issue of a special sort for any musician, right? And so we can assume that his music, his life, and so on will look and be different on either side of the point where he realized that his deafness was going to be irreversible and was going to define his abilities as a musician who interacted with other people, right? So that's one easy and obvious marker for Beethoven's style period, but there are also others, and they come in part from the world around him. Beethoven was born in Bonn, which is in Western Germany, and was a fairly small city, and there he received his musical education, started composing, and his musical compositions during what is called the Bonn style period are pieces which start out as student works but are really full-fledged, perfectly admirable compositions by the time he gets into about his 18th, 19th year. He was a composer who was writing compositions by the time he turned 18 or 19 that most of us would be proud to write when we were 30, 40, 50, even my age, which is 58. So we talk about Beethoven's Bonn style period as being one distinct thing. In the years right around the 1790s, which is after the eruption of the French Revolution, which was perilously close to Bonn on the west side of Germany, Beethoven decided to move east and south to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, to Vienna in Austria. Part of his motivation in doing this was to meet and take lessons with the by then legendary Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who, however, was dead by the time that Beethoven had any opportunity to do this, and so Beethoven ended up taking some lessons and working with Franz Joseph Haydn. These are both names you know. Beethoven here at this point is a full-fledged composer, somebody who is able to make it as a professional and does so, and he loves living and working with the rich and famous and powerful in the cultural and political capital of Vienna. But this first Vienna period, or early Vienna period, is a period in which Beethoven is establishing himself among the musical professionals and in the musical world of the day in the capital of one of the great musical capitals of Europe. So we speak of Beethoven's early Vienna period as being roughly 1791 or 1792 up until about 1803. But then, in 1803, Beethoven, who has been having problems hearing what his potential benefactors and patrons have been saying to him increasingly over the course of the previous decade, realizes that his deafness is going to be a very real thing, is not going to be reversed, and so on. And so he enters into a personal crisis of deafness. He actually pens a letter to his brothers, which suggests that he is contemplating suicide. This is known, by the way, you'll hear the term, as the Heiligenstadt Testament, because that is the suburb of Vienna where Beethoven wrote it. And then Beethoven has a change of heart and decides that he has to keep going. And he actually writes to one of his publishers that he has to find a new way of composing. This is in the year 1803. Now, quite coincidentally, but not insignificantly, 1803 is also the year in which one of Beethoven's heroes in life, Napoleon Bonaparte, has taken over much of Europe, installed puppet governments so that all of Europe becomes a part of Greater France, as it was called at the time, under the leadership of Napoleon. And in 1803, 1804, Napoleon decides that he is emperor of the French, which means emperor of all of these people who are subject to European rule, to French rule throughout Europe. So 1803 is a style period that is articulated in Beethoven's life partly by his contemplation of suicide and then his renewed resolve to speak in a voice that was uniquely his own, a new way of composing. And it had to do with this period where Europe itself is in a kind of political crisis, where yes, things were stable within any given country, including the German lands, but only if you had already become a part of Greater France. Now, to put this in perspective, imagine us in the United States today if, let's say, Canada were to have decided that it was going to take over all of North America and make all of North America a province of Greater Canada, right? We in the United States might be happy with some things that are happening under Canadian rule, but at the same time, there would be a real measure of discontent that would be very upsetting, very worrisome, and kind of challenge all of our notions of ourselves as a nation, as North Americans, as citizens of the United States. The United States would still exist, but would be a part of Canada in this fictitious scenario. That is a very good counterpart to the situation of Beethoven's Germany and Austria. They were suburbs of Greater France, and there is a real problem that goes with being this. It caused something that would be a phenomenon in Beethoven's middle period style that would be extremely extroverted, extremely outgoing, very courageous, calling to bravery, and so on. We will see this in the work by Beethoven that we're looking at today, and that is the Fifth Symphony. So we have seen two style periods already, the Bonn style period and the early Vienna style period. And then we just looked at the third style period, which is the Middle Vienna period, which is articulated in 1803 by Beethoven's awareness of his deafness and by the political changes that are throwing all of Europe into turmoil in what's called the Napoleonic Wars, the wars that Napoleon and his empire led against all of Europe. What happens is that in 1814, 1815, all of Europe, the countries whose leaders had been subjugated to Napoleonic rule, finally find the wherewithal to form an alliance, and they take back over and they defeat Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken over all of Europe, banish him to Europe, to the island of Elba, and then they form what is called the Congress of Vienna, which is where Beethoven is living at this time, and they redraw the map of Europe, establishing a set of monarchies that basically look like what monarchies have always looked like in Europe. Note the year, 1815. Okay, 1814, 1815. That coincides with the point at which Beethoven realized that not only realized that his deafness was going to be permanent, but also went into serious issues with his nephew and so on. And so beginning around 1815, Beethoven's style changes once again. The first 5 or 6 years of this period, 1815 to 1820, let's say, are years in which Beethoven doesn't compose much, and what he does compose is different than what he had been writing in the previous decade, but there's not much of it. Then around 1820, he enters into the second half of this fourth style period, which is called the Late Vienna period. And in this period, from 1820 to 1827, Beethoven writes prolifically and in every style that one can imagine. So in his Late Vienna period, the fourth style period, Beethoven writes pieces that on the one hand are often introspective, highly complicated, learned, difficult to understand, and seem devoted to his just speaking to himself with no regard for whether or not other people can understand or do understand. On the other hand, Beethoven, during the same style period, is writing dinky little marches, folk song arrangements, and pieces that are unabashedly trite, commercial, let's say. Right, and he's writing everything in the middle. Beethoven, by this point, has reached a stage in his life where he can do anything that he wants to compositionally, because his musical imagination is basically boundless, and this is an extremely complicated style period. Now let's tie that into what we've seen already. What happens here is that Beethoven is a person who was able to do this in his Middle and Late Vienna period through a new kind of social and professional arrangement that he had. As we mentioned, during the Bonn style period and the early Vienna period, he built up a huge fan base of people who were following his work, who supported him and wanted to do so. When it becomes impossible for Beethoven to get out there and rub elbows with the rich and the famous after we get into the Late Vienna period, or the Middle Vienna period, a network of those people puts together an annual stipend for Beethoven, which would enable him to live comfortably, not lavishly, but comfortably for the rest of his life without having to interact. And he still composes and publishes pieces and makes money from them. So what you see in Beethoven, beginning in the Middle Vienna period, is a composer who has become a public composer, but is still working with a variant of the old patronage system. He has a network of 3 patrons who give him an annual stipend. He still gets individual people to commission and sponsor the publication of individual pieces, and yet he makes music from the public by selling it. He is a composer who ascends to the very pinnacle of fame in Europe, and there's only one composer whose fame rivals him. Do you know who that is? I'll tell you, it is Giacomo Rossini. Rossini, the Italian composer whom we know as the composer of mostly light and eminently singable operas. We'll be looking at Rossini a little bit later in this course and then again in Lit 3. But I want you to be aware of 3 things from this opening set of clips in this lecture. One of them is that Beethoven had 4 style periods, and I'm doing this as if I'm holding up my fingers for my 3 grandsons, because whenever you're teaching to children and you say a small number, you hold up your fingers, right? Additionally, Beethoven is a composer who represents a transition from the patronage system to the age of public patronage by means of this virtual network of patrons that he established. And then the third thing I want you to know from this is that Beethoven's style periods all differ from one another. The representative style period, and the one that really made him famous, is the Middle Vienna period, which was the third in the set of 4. Let me tell you, you will read, including in your textbook that we have for this class, that Beethoven had 3 style periods. That is not true if one looks at the facts. That's a notion that was developed in the 19th century before people knew much about Beethoven's life and work. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Music Lit Sweepstakes. Listen, without further ado, let me just remind you that we're on the honor code. You cannot tell the people who won today's sweepstakes that they have won or in any way tip them off. They have to see this for themselves by watching today's lecture. So, without further ado, you know the rules. Today's winners will, number one, send me an email within 24 to 36 hours telling me that they know that they won and asking me what I want to know. Number two, after I respond, they will tell me the answer to the question within 24 hours of the point when I ask that. So, without further ado, let's see who got it today. Today's first winner is Lavender. Lavender, congratulations. You have won 3 points added on to your final exam score for Music Lit 1. Congratulations, assuming you do all those things. And number two, today's second winner, Brooks. Congratulations, Brooks. You won today's. So, you guys know what to do. Send me an email within 24 to 36 hours of our scheduled class time. I'll send you a question. Within 24 hours of getting that question, you respond to me. All right, congratulations, and I will see you all on the other side. Thanks for being here. Bye. Hey, look at that. I'm on a Polaroid coming out of some woman's Polaroid camera. Huh. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about this Middle Vienna period, and then we'll talk about the Fifth Symphony. The first thing I want to remind you of is that the Middle Vienna period is articulated by two events, Beethoven's deafness in the personal sphere and by the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon's ascension to the throne as Emperor of the French, meaning all of French-speaking Europe. The characteristics of this style period are partly the fact that it is extremely extroverted in style. You hear very tuneful melodies. You hear a lot of subito fortes, those SFs that you see all over the score. All of these things are things which make this music of the Middle Vienna period extremely engaging in Beethoven's style. This is also the point where in the arts and literature, generally speaking, we speak of the emergence of the Romantic movement. This is characterized in part by an emergence of a sense of history. Now, beginning in these early years of the 19th century, composers seem to be thinking, and in fact they are thinking, in terms of not just writing for themselves and their audiences, then and there, but actually writing for history to look back on them. They want to leave a legacy. And this changes the way that people write. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. If you ask a different question, you will get a different answer. If a composer in the early 19th century asks himself, what do my audiences want? Then he or she might write one thing. If that same composer asks himself, what should I write that will be of enduring historical value for future audiences, then that composer will write something different, right? The same is true of Beethoven and of all of his contemporaries. At the early 19th century, there is a fascination with history. Additionally, this is a sense in which every composer begins to think of him or herself as someone who has the right to speak in a distinctive and unique style. Mozart was not, or when we speak of Mozart in the previous generation, we're speaking of a composer who was writing in a consciously international cosmopolitan style, and he made all kinds of references to other composers. He did not go out of his way to sound unique. When we get into the early 19th century in this Romantic movement as personified in Beethoven and all of his contemporaries, composers are consciously trying to sound unique, individuals, speaking with a voice that is their own and could not be confused with anyone else's voice. This is also a generation that is increasingly fascinated with the notion of synesthesia, something in which one sensory trigger will also trigger other reactions in other senses, right? So it becomes possible and common in this period for people to think that we should be able to see music. When you are listening to a piece such as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which we're going to look at in just a moment, I promise, you should not only hear the notes, you should not only be thinking about what's being played and so on, you should actually be visualizing what's happening. A visual imagination. Those of you who are visual learners, this is your time in history, right? You should also be thinking, according to Beethoven and his contemporaries, in terms that are kind of narrative. Hear these pieces as stories. So when we think about the Fifth Symphony, it consists of four movements, as we'll see. The first of them is very much a turbulent movement that has a strong sense of strife and struggle to it, and so on. The second movement is kind of a respite or break from that strife and struggle. It's very calm, but there are these insistent returns of the motive, short, 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 long, from the first movement that keep coming in there and interrupting. When we get to the third movement, we return to a kind of dark mode that starts off rather ominously, and then the horns come in all their glory, giving you a theme that is, once again, based on that short, 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 long motive from the beginning of the first movement of this symphony. And then that kind of collapses towards the end of the third movement into something that sounds brooding, ominous, worrisome, murky, and then we finally make a rather sudden transition into the fourth movement, which is triumphant, even jubilant, joyous in its character. Those four movements trace a story from struggle, strife, and so on, through calm that has an element of worry to it, through something that is once again dark and has an element of struggle, through to victory. This is an example of that engaging way of thinking that is characteristic of Beethoven's Middle Vienna period, and it's also characteristic of the synesthetic approaches to composing music that is typical of the Romantic movement in 19th century movement. Another final idea that I want you to know is that this is the age in which the idea of organicism flourishes. Organicism basically says that just as all organs, all living organisms in the world grow from a seed and trace their lifespan over the maturation of that seed before it comes to its end, which is a nice way of saying dies, so too do artworks. Musical compositions should be unified all the way through, and the most common way of doing this is exactly what we see in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. He uses that four-note motive, short, 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 long, that we hear at the beginning of the first movement, and it comes back in all four movements. Yet its character changes over the course of those four movements, from something in the first movement, which is very challenging and turbulent, struggling, and so on, through to the jubilation that we have in the last movement. That traces a narrative of sorts. It's kind of an emotional narrative, but that's still a narrative, a story, a progression from beginning through the middle to the end, and the listeners' and performers' imagination are supposed to carry them with it over the course of those four movements. So now let's turn to the Fifth Symphony, and I want to make you aware of several things as we do this. First of all, it is a representative of Beethoven's Middle Vienna period. It's extremely extroverted, it's extremely tuneful, it has a sense of a very strong organic unity in the sense that that short, 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 long motive that we hear at the beginning of the first movement never leaves us. We can never get past it. It ties the piece together organically from beginning to end. And one of the other stylistic traits of this Middle Vienna period is that there are subito fortes, SFs, all over the place in this score. Those are dynamic and stylistic outbursts which are supposed to keep performers and listeners on the edge of their seats, and it works. Wow, look at that. Okay, so this is not social distancing, but that's okay. I'm cool with it because somebody is actually talking about me and has me in a Skype video conference before an obviously crowded hall, although those people look kind of sleepy. Anyway, so let's talk about the Fifth Symphony. First of all, I want you to keep in mind those things that we just talked about. I also want you to remember that this is a very dramatic work as well. Listen to how much contrast there is in the Fifth Symphony as you're listening across the span of those four movements. Beethoven keeps building up to climaxes, then he pulls you away and so on, and the idea is to keep this so that you cannot stop listening throughout the course of the Fifth Symphony. Additionally, we talked about how it's unified. That motive comes back in all four movements of the piece, but The sense of this being one piece is heightened by two other little tricks that Beethoven plays. First of all, the third and fourth movements are conjoined, which is to say the third movement doesn't actually end, right? You have listened to it by now, and if you haven't, you're going to listen to it in just a moment. And you'll hear that the third movement actually doesn't have a final cadence or anything like it. It leads directly without pause into the fourth movement, which is where that joyous, triumphant style breaks through. And yet, the other stylistic trick that he plays is that even after we get into that fourth movement, at the point where we are expecting a recapitulation, the closing section of a sonata form such as this one, Beethoven brings back the third movement in the middle of the fourth. And then finally, he kind of repeats a modified version of that transition, original transition to the fourth movement, and once again we get the triumphant stuff, and then the piece can end. All of that makes the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven seem like one single unified work in four big parts. This is something which was pretty new at the time, and it became something that was a stylistic trait that the later 19th century revered in Beethoven, the idea of creating an organically unified composition that is also, at least implicitly, programmatic, tries to tell a story in tones without the use of words. So with that, I'll leave you to listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Please give it a close listen with score. I hope you'll enjoy this piece. It's a masterpiece. It's instructive. It's one of the most revered and imitated compositions in all of music's history. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.